there, welcome to the show. Today I'm going to talk about American Revolution, a Ken Burns documentary that he co-directed, produced and set up, which he's been working on for years. Now, Ken Burns has done a lot of interesting films. He's done American Civil War, he's done Baseball, he produced The West, he's he's done World War II, he's done the Vietnam War. But he is most famous for the Civil War and doing a lot of historical documentaries. He can exist out a realm of getting public funding and getting funding from private sectors. So you get advertised at the start for the people who've helped fund him. It's just the way he gets funding for his films. That's just the way things are for this. It's just how he does it. What I would say is, I think he relies now a lot more on private funding for the films because a lot of the public funding has been taken away over the years, and basically because of the American government having less interest in PBS, especially now under Trump, who really cut so much. So I'm not sure how we'll get funding from in the future. But he did manage to make the American Revolution, which is a terrific documentary. I don't think it's as strong as the Civil War documentary, but the Civil War documentary was so fresh. It's probably for most people the first Ken Burns film they'd seen, unless you had PBS, because it's the first one that went really out into the world beyond documentary fans and made an impact. So it's kind of hard to tell whether it was a better one or just because it's the first one we saw, but it felt more intimate than this one. This one has such a lot to cover, and it's only got like 6 episodes, all of which are about 2 hours long, like 1 hour 50 to just over 2 hours, depending on the episode. So there's a lot to cover, and they cover a hell of a lot over time, from the start with the start of the tensions that went to the war from over 20 years to the declaration of war, the Declaration of Independence, the wars that went through, the battles went through where the Americans won and lost, where the British won and lost, why the British ended up giving up. It covers all of that. It covers the slave situation, which was very complicated because anyone who was black in America and were a slave, their alliances was pretty much based upon who would give them freedom rather than America or Britain. And in Britain, actually gave much better assurances of getting freedom than the Americans ever did. So that's a kind of complicated situation that the film addresses. There's also the complicated situation where the one of the things Americans were very angry about, which led to the War of Independence, was they couldn't expand west into Indian territory, which obviously once America declared independence, they would do with ferocity. So there was a lot to, deal with in this documentary, not just the American revolutionaries, what they were about, what the passions were, but also the kind of more complicated story about slavery, how it existed in Americas, and the Indian question, because they did not present them, the American founding fathers, as all great all the time. It's like, no, they had their flaws. Quite a lot of them were slave owners. George Washington was definitely interested in expanding west. He was definitely a big landowner who had a lot of money, and he's interested in expanding. A lot of other people within the founding fathers wanted to expand. They felt they were trapped in this one edge of the continent, and it wasn't healthy for them. And people were getting oppressed in this area because further west was the Spanish territories. I mean, already by this point, they had won the 7-Year War against the French, the British had. So after they won that war, the British were like, okay, finally we can exploit this area. And then they never really managed to, because by the time after 20 years had passed, they were starting to need money to pay for the wars they'd already fought, and a lot of it was taxation, and they were also paying for different interests they had all over the world, which America was just one of them. They had Indian interests, they had the Caribbean interests, they had a lot of places where they were making lots of money, and this was Britain like before its real fall, and it was going to lose a lot of its interests over the next 150 years. You know, starting with America, then the Caribbean, and eventually it would walk away from the slave trade and declare it illegal. I mean, Britain was one of the first ones to really do that, and they were more aware of they could actually get the slaves on their side if they offered them freedom. So Britain's place in this is not as villainous as some Americans would like to make out. It's not that we're innocent in any way, they were not. They were slavers, there was also slavers in the Caribbean, they had lots of interests all over the world, they were minted, but they were also having financial difficulties in certain areas and needed to fill certain gaps. There was such a big, expansive empire that there's a lot of money in and out and lots of interlinked interests which they had to command. So the way our empire stretched thin. And it also meant is that they could not focus on just America. They had to focus on the Caribbean and India and the worldwide trade and with their boats. They had a lot to do. So when America started to act up against some of the laws, they initially just sent people there and said, just deal with this. Just get rid of these leaders and just deal with it. They dealt with it way too harshly. And what was like already something boiling under the skin of a lot of Americans of it, not being allowed to do what they want to do, became something feeling much more oppressive when a lot of taxes came in that the Americans felt were unjust. And basically, Britain did not listen to what was going on, and they would constantly up the ante on what would be disputes to a point where America was like, no, we've had enough. That's it, we've had enough. And this film actually delivers on this complication, giving you this complication, giving you this idea of what was going on, what was the problem, and giving you a sense of we have to deal with this. So what we have in this documentary is the complexity of these issues. Like, what is these issues that are going to be a problem for both America and Britain over time, and what the documentary actually shows is the kind of slow escalation of the issues from peace to war, and then throughout the war. Like, what were the issues for the Indians? What were the issues for the black slaved population? How did they have to go from one side to the other, depending on who occupied the territories at that time, who was offering freedom at that time, who was offering not to kill them at that time in case of the Indians? There was a lot of problems that they had to deal with. There was a lot of issues that were difficult for them, that were tricky and needed some attention, that were really needing something that was, complicated. And how do you work through a sense of issues that changes every 10 minutes? In the kind of life of the war, where 1 minute you could be occupied by Americans, then not long later the British take that territory, so in the case of New York, and they're there for like 4 years. And so you've gone from being like pro, like at least being like having some allegiances to the independence movement, and suddenly you have to say, oh yeah, we're pure British, we're pro Britain, we'll align ourselves to you, and then as soon as they're gone, it's like, now we'll stick to the Americans. And that was just Americans. And if you were from the minorities, like an Indian or a black person, you just had to be really careful. you could get killed for any little infraction. And everybody was mad over every little infraction, so they would come for you if you did anything they thought you were wrong. Like, you could get killed for anything. The white people were killing white people for anything. For any kind of saying, oh, you're still a loyalist to the crown, so you must die. So, in this time was a racist time. They did not see Indians as, at least in certain areas, they did not see Indians as people or black people as people. They saw them as either someone in their way or someone they could exploit. That's all they saw them as, so you could easily get killed if you were just unlucky. And that's what this film does really well, is to suggest how difficult all this was, how much of a problem this environment was for anyone. It was just a ticking time bomb. And state after state, there's 13 colonies. Every state had its tensions. Like, in the South, they were much more pro-slavery. In the North, slavery wasn't a big an issue because they didn't rely on slavery. Britain relied on slavery a lot in the Caribbean, so they were not going to bring any of this war to the Caribbean. And it would have to be very tough in the Caribbean to make sure everyone knew no rebellion in the Caribbean. So everyone had stakes everywhere. So Britain would have a policy in America that would not line up to the policy in the Caribbean. They would have policies in India that were different from anywhere else, and it was like, this was a war that started to affect the British Empire everywhere. Also, you had the French, who did not like the British, obviously, and they were trying to manipulate and support the Americans because they knew basically, well, if we lost the 20-year war, or the 7-year war, now if we can actually, and 20 years later, we can maybe use this to our advantage to mess with the British if they lose this command of this territory. This could really mess them up. So the film got into all of those details, all of these little issues that become a real problem for these characters. Not characters, people. And the film is all about the kind of variety of issues that go from all 13 colonies, with all different interests, some of whom at some points are ruled over the British, sometimes are ruled over by the Americans, sometimes the British are ruling them so badly they're fighting back. You have the Americans sometimes having victories but also making horrible mistakes. You have the British doing the same. And you had some British officers behaving terribly to Americans, which makes them rebel. You had some British officers not exactly being in, alignment with their leaders about what they should be doing. Everybody had a complicated view of the war and a complicated view of independence, and a lot of them didn't have precise views, especially in the British end. And the Americans had a variety of different interests. The Americans had the 13 colonies, all of whom had to agree to everything, and they weren't centralised. And the war wasn't centralised, and you had a variety of people changing their mind. And Benedict Arnold going from being on the American Revolution side to being on the British side, even though he was once a major American hero, and he turned on them because he wasn't given enough, love by the American side. And you had George Washington making some horrible mistakes, but also keeping them together. You'd had him starting to build up a series of people he could trust around him, who could go and do things, that could organise for him. You had him dealing with the fact that the people in the army weren't getting paid a lot of the time, and they were freezing to death during the winter, and it was having to deal with people financing the war who were obviously profiteering off it. And all these issues. And a lot of the people fighting the war were the poor, ultimately. And the people who actually gained from the war were the rich who did not fight it. Or at least didn't fight it to the same degree as the poor did. So essentially a lot of people who fought in the war, who did the most of the fighting, made the least from it. And the whole film is about this issue of nobody really had much of a chance to do much with this war. This war was, you know, like very difficult for lots and lots of people. And it was never really something that was well planned by either side. They were pushed into things happened. They had some good organisers, but some terrible organisers, some terrible people, some decent people. He had lots of grudges that was causing chaos throughout the land constantly. It was much less streamlined. And that's the film shows all of these details of this, of how it affected people through photographs, through the voiceovers, which are read off by actors, and some paintings, and just the sense of there was a myth of the war that grew up after the war had finished that wasn't actually the war. It was the kind of mythology of it that wasn't actually the reality of what happened during the war, which is something that people had to learn to deal with. There was mythology even throughout the war, like Washington was the great general and he never made mistakes, even when he obviously had made some horrible mistakes. There was the mythology of who the British were and what they were about, which wasn't always a reality. There's a mythology of what the British, what the Americans were about, which wasn't the reality. People were mythologizing each other throughout the war, and what was viewed to the outside was this big noble thing was actually a bitter civil war where lots and lots of people died in horrible ways, and lots of vendettas were created, and a lot of people ended up with nothing and exiled from their homes, and out of that grew a country, but it was a very complicated process, and this film shows that. So in some ways it doesn't have the same simplistic narrative that Civil War had. Civil War had the creation of the tension between the North and the South, and you got a resolution. In this one, there's a resolution, but it's not as easy to deal with. It is complicated, the resolution, so it is more difficult to work with, really. So that's one of the things that I found fascinating about it. So I hope this interests you. I hope you enjoyed this video. I found the American Revolution to be a really fascinating video. First to watch the film, but also try and talk about it because it is so complicated. I hope you actually go and find this, documentary, because it is really worthwhile. So that's me for now. I hope you enjoyed this. I'll see you all with the next one. Bye.